Chapter 8. The Consequences of Defiance. The storm had faded, leaving the night eerily silent, but Eleanor could feel a tension in the air, as thick as the rain-soaked earth beneath her. Shadows loomed over the village, casting elongated figures across the cobblestone streets and flickering through the cracks of her shuttered window. Darkmoor's secrets had been unearthed, and now it seemed the village itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor sat at her small wooden table, poring over the confessions she had uncovered, each page detailing the grim, twisted history of the pact. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly, and she peered cautiously through a narrow gap in her window. Groups of villagers, cloaked and murmuring, gathered in the square, whispering about the pact and her challenge to it. Some looked wary, others fearful, but all eyes turned toward her cottage as if expecting something ominous to unfold. An unexpected visitor. As she tried to make sense of the confessions, a knock sounded at her door, sharp and insistent. She tensed, heart pounding as she crossed the room, clutching the confession pages close. When she opened the door, she found Oswin standing there, his face grim and set in shadow. "Eleanor," he said quietly, stepping inside before she could invite him. "You've done a brave thing tonight, but there are many in the village who aren't ready to abandon the pact. I came to warn you. Father Roland and his followers are preparing to retaliate. They fear that by breaking the pact, you've cursed us all." Eleanor's jaw tightened. If they want to cling to lies, they're welcome to. But I won't let them drag this village down with their superstition. Oswin nodded, his gaze dark. "You'll need allies. There are others who support you, but they're scared. The pact has bound them in fear their entire lives, and fear isn't easy to shake. And Father Roland, he won't let this go." Eleanor swallowed, her anger mingling with a growing dread. "Then we'll have to show them that the pact is nothing but a lie. If we can break his hold over the village, they might finally understand." A growing threat. As Oswin left, Eleanor felt the oppressive weight of the night bearing down on her. She knew Father Roland was planning something, and that he wouldn't stop until he'd restored the pact's power or eliminated her. The clock struck 1, the sound echoing through the silent village, and a creeping sense of dread wound through her chest. She tried to focus on the pages in front of her, but her thoughts kept turning back to the villagers still loyal to the pact. How far would they go to preserve it? And would they stop at nothing to silence her? Just then, she heard faint chanting drifting through her window. Curious, Eleanor peered outside and caught sight of a procession moving through the village, led by Father Roland. They were carrying lanterns, their shadows shifting and dancing as they headed toward the woods. Their voices rose in eerie harmony, a rhythmic chant she had never heard before, and the air grew thick with tension. Following the procession. Steeling herself, Eleanor grabbed her cloak and slipped out of her cottage, keeping to the shadows as she followed the procession. She clutched the confession pages tightly, determined to confront Father Roland and force him to face the truth he had so desperately tried to bury. The procession wound its way through the village and into the woods, lanterns casting flickering pools of light on the damp ground. Eleanor trailed behind, her footsteps muffled by the earth. The villagers' voices grew louder, their chanting echoing through the trees. each word carrying a weight that seemed to resonate in her very bones. The procession stopped at the stone altar she had found earlier that night, the one where her spouse had left her the final clues to uncovering Darkmoor's pact. Father Roland stood at the front, his face shrouded in shadow as he addressed the villagers. Father Roland's speech. "Tonight, our pact has been broken," Father Roland declared, his voice cold and commanding. "Our safety is at risk. The one who defied our ancient agreement stands before us, condemning us all to ruin. We must restore the pact or suffer the consequences." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, though some villagers looked uncertain, casting glances over their shoulders as if considering fleeing. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unwavering. "The pact is nothing but lies," she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "These confessions tell the truth. Darkmoor has been held captive by fear, not protected by it. My spouse knew this, and now I know it too. The pact doesn't protect us. It enslaves us." The villagers turned to face her, shock and fear flickering across their faces. Father Roland's expression twisted with anger, his hands clenching into fists. "You foolish woman," he spat. "Your defiance has sealed your fate. There are forces at work here that you cannot comprehend." The villagers begin to doubt. Eleanor held up the confession pages, her voice ringing out with clarity. "These are the words of your ancestors, confessions that speak of needless sacrifices, acts of cruelty justified by a lie. My spouse saw the truth and paid with their life. But I will not be silenced." Several villagers shifted uncomfortably, casting uncertain glances between Eleanor and Father Roland. Oswin, standing near the edge of the crowd, nodded in support, and a few others followed his lead, rallying quietly behind Eleanor. Father Roland's eyes gleamed with fury. "You would defy the shadows themselves, Eleanor? So be it. But remember this, you cannot change what has been bound by blood. The pact will reclaim what is owed." A supernatural unveiling. As his words echoed through the night, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing several lanterns. The temperature dropped, a biting cold settling over them, and a heavy mist began to roll in, cloaking the trees in an impenetrable fog. The villagers looked around in fear, clutching their cloaks as an eerie silence fell. Father Roland lifted his hands, his voice trembling with anger and something close to desperation. "You see," he shouted, "the shadows do not forgive. They are here. They have come to punish our defiance." Eleanor stood firm, though a chill crept up her spine. She had spent her life dismissing the tales of curses and shadows as mere superstition. But something in the air felt undeniably wrong, as if a force beyond her understanding had indeed been awakened. Eleanor's defiance. She took a steadying breath and stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice strong. "Whatever you see here tonight, it is not a curse. It is the fear you have nurtured, the terror you have fed, and now it has become something real, something that exists only because you have allowed it to." The mist swirled around her, and for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving within it, dark, spectral forms that seemed to pulse with life. But she refused to let fear sway her. She held up the confession pages, letting them catch the wind, and spoke to the villagers with unwavering conviction. "This pact does not own us," she declared. "We are free to choose our own fate." Let these words be a testament to those who suffered under this lie, and let them be a promise that we will no longer live in fear. Father Roland's downfall. Her words seemed to break a spell, and the villagers' fearful expressions began to change, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Father Roland saw his influence slipping, and desperation twisted his face. "You will all suffer for this," he shouted, his voice breaking. "The shadows will claim you, every last one of you." But as he spoke, the villagers closed in around him, their faces hard with resolve. They had heard Eleanor's words, and for the first time, they saw Father Roland for what he truly was, a man who had used their fear to control them. Oswin stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Enough, Roland. Darkmoor will no longer be bound by shadows." Realizing he was defeated, Father Roland shrank back, his power broken, his threats now empty echoes in the clearing. The pact is broken. As the mist began to fade, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The villagers murmured among themselves, casting wary but grateful glances in her direction. The pact had been broken, and with it, the hold that fear had kept on Darkmoor for generations. Oswin approached her, nodding solemnly. "You did it, Eleanor. You freed us all." Eleanor managed a small, exhausted smile, though grief for her spouse still weighed heavily on her heart. "We're free now," she replied, "and maybe now we can begin to heal." Chapter 9. The Dawn. After the storm. The storm had finally lifted, leaving the village blanketed in a mist that clung to the cobblestones and softened the gray light of dawn. Eleanor stood in the square, her cloak still damp and heavy, her mind reeling from the events of the night. Darkmoor was different now. The pact was broken, and Father Roland's influence had been shattered. But as she looked around at the wary, uncertain faces of the villagers, she knew that freedom alone could not erase years of fear. Villagers murmured in hushed tones, still glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting the shadows to reclaim them at any moment. Some lingered near their homes, unwilling to leave the safety of familiar walls. Others eyed Eleanor with a mix of awe and trepidation, grateful for her bravery, yet fearful of the repercussions. An uneasy peace. Oswin approached her, his face etched with weariness, but softened by a quiet pride. "You've done what none of us ever dared, Eleanor," he said. "But it won't be easy for people to move on from what they've known all their lives. Fear doesn't vanish overnight." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "The pact may be gone, but the memories remain," she murmured. "They'll linger, even in the hearts of those who wanted to be free." As they spoke, the tavern keeper's wife approached, her face set in a frown. "Are you satisfied now, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You've torn apart our traditions, left us with nothing to protect us. What will you do when the shadows come back to punish us all?" Eleanor met her gaze, calm but resolute. "The only shadows that ever haunted this village were born from fear," she replied. "We created them ourselves, and they've ruled over us because we allowed it. But we're strong enough to move forward, strong enough to be free." The woman scoffed, muttering under her breath as she walked away. But Eleanor sensed that her doubts were less about the pact and more about the loss of the certainty it had provided. She knew there were many like her in in the village, struggling to accept the sudden change, clinging to the old ways, even as they questioned their truth. A final letter from her spouse. As the day wore on, and villagers began to drift back to their routines, Eleanor returned to her cottage. The events of the night had left her drained, but she knew she couldn't rest, not while so many questions remained unanswered. She needed closure, a sense of finality to her spouse's death that the broken pact alone couldn't provide. In her cottage, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, folded piece of parchment wedged into the bottom drawer of her spouse's desk. Heart pounding, she carefully unfolded the page, her spouse's familiar handwriting sending a pang of grief through her chest. My dearest Eleanor, I fear the truth I have uncovered may lead me into danger, but I can no longer ignore it. The pact binds this village in a way that strips us of our humanity, keeping us in fear of shadows and punishing those who defy it. I am not afraid of what the shadows might bring, for I know they are only as powerful as we believe them to be. But I am afraid for Darkmoor, afraid of the hold this lie has on our hearts. If you are reading this, it means I have failed to show the village what I know. Please, Eleanor, do not let my death be in vain. Show them that they can be free, that they can break these chains. Let them know that no shadows can own us. Not anymore. With all my love, your devoted partner. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes as she read the final lines. Her spouse had known the risks, yet they had been driven by a love not just for her, but for the entire village. They had seen the truth as a way to save Darkmoor from its own past, and they had paid the ultimate price. A conversation with Oswin. Later that evening, as twilight settled over Darkmoor, Eleanor met Oswin in the square. She showed him the letter, her spouse's words lingering in the quiet between them. They were trying to save us all, Oswin said softly, his voice heavy with regret. And none of us listened. We let the pact rule us, let Father Roland twist our fear into something far darker than any curse. Eleanor nodded. The shadows were never real, Oswin. We gave them life, let them haunt us, because it was easier than facing the truth. She paused, gazing out over the village as the final traces of daylight disappeared. But the village has a chance now. We can be free of this. Oswin hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. You've done more than free us, Eleanor. You've given us a chance to rebuild, to remember what it's like to live without fear. Darkmoor will owe you a debt for as long as we stand. The village divided, but not everyone shared Oswin's sense of hope. As the days passed, Eleanor noticed that certain villagers remained aloof, casting her wary glances and whispering behind her back. Some still believed in the pact, in the shadows that supposedly watched over them. Without Father Roland's guidance, they had become leaderless, their faith shaken, but not entirely shattered. A small group of these villagers met in secret, seeking to reinstate the pact, clinging to the belief that only by honoring the past could they ensure the village's survival. Though few in number, they remained vocal, stirring up fear and suspicion wherever they went. One evening, Eleanor was confronted by one of them, a woman named Agatha, who had been a fervent supporter of Father Roland. You may think you've won, Eleanor, she said, her eyes narrowed with barely contained anger. But you've only invited ruin upon us all. You will see. Darkmoor's fate is sealed without the pact. held her gaze, unflinching. The only ruin that comes to Darkmoor will be of our own making. We're free now, Agatha. It's up to us to decide what we do with that freedom. A new beginning for Darkmoor. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor witnessed a gradual transformation in Darkmoor. The village, once shrouded in shadows, began to embrace a cautious optimism. People moved more freely, smiled more openly, and gathered in the square without the tension that had once weighed on every interaction. The old stories began to fade, no longer whispered with reverence, but told as relics of the past. Children laughed and played in places they had once feared, and the villagers who had once been bound by secrecy found solace in the lightness of newfound freedom. Oswin and a few others started gathering at the tavern to plan for the future of Darkmoor. Together, they discussed ways to honor the past without being bound by it, to build a village that could stand without the weight of superstition pressing down on it. And though there were challenges, Eleanor saw the strength of a community willing to confront the truth and grow from it. Eleanor's final tribute. One evening, Eleanor returned to the clearing in the woods where the stone altar stood. She placed her spouse's letter on the weathered stone, whispering a quiet promise to honor their memory by ensuring that Darkmoor would never again fall under the spell of fear. She felt a peace she hadn't known in months as she walked back toward the village. Her spouse's legacy would live on in Darkmoor, not as a memory of sacrifice, but as a testament to courage and the willingness to face darkness with open eyes. As she entered the square, Oswin waved her over, a hint of a smile on his face. "We're talking about building a new meeting hall," he said. "A place where people can gather without fear. Thought you might want to help." Eleanor returned his smile, feeling the warmth of her community surround her. Darkmoor was changing, and though it would take time, she knew they would find their way. Chapter 10. A Forgotten History. Weeks had passed since the night Eleanor had broken the pact. Though Darkmoor was adjusting slowly, a newfound lightness had crept into the village. Smiles were seen more often, laughter drifted through the streets, and people walked without constantly glancing over their shoulders. Still, despite the peace, Eleanor sensed something lingering beneath the surface, unanswered questions that weighed on her like shadows. She felt her spouse's presence more acutely than ever, and a gentle restlessness nudged at her. Though she had uncovered much about Darkmoor's pact, she couldn't shake the feeling that a final piece of the puzzle lay hidden, waiting to be discovered. Perhaps it was a tribute to her spouse's memory, or perhaps a desire to bring true closure to Darkmoor. Either way, Eleanor knew she had one last journey to make. A rumor of an old journal. One afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the village, she was approached by an older man named Edwin, one of the oldest residents of Darkmoor and a former friend of her spouse's family. Edwin was often overlooked by the villagers, his quiet presence and wandering mind seeming to belong to another time entirely. But today, his eyes sparkled with a strange clarity. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice creaky but determined. "I knew your spouse well. They were good-hearted, a true soul of this village, and I know they left something behind, something you'll want to see." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Edwin's gaze softened, a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. "There's a journal. Your spouse asked me to keep it safe, told me it held secrets about the village's past, secrets that were older even than the pact itself. I don't know what's in it, but if you're still seeking the truth, you should take it." Without hesitation, Eleanor followed him to his cottage. Edwin disappeared into a back room and returned holding a small, leather-bound journal. It was worn and faded, but the pages were thick with writing, marked with symbols and drawings she'd never seen before. "Your spouse gave this to me before things turned dark," Edwin murmured. "They said it would help you understand. I don't know much else, but I'm certain they wanted you to have it." Discovering Darkmoor's origins. Back at her cottage, Eleanor lit a candle and settled at her desk, carefully opening the journal's pages. Her spouse's handwriting filled the first few pages, recounting stories of the pact and the altar in the woods, much of it familiar from what she had already learned. But as she read on, the entries took on a darker, more secretive tone. One entry in particular caught her eye, dated just days before their death. "I've uncovered something much older than the pact, a truth hidden in plain sight. The founders of Darkmoor were not merely villagers seeking refuge. They brought with them a curse, a darkness born from a betrayal that stretches back to lands far beyond these woods. They bound that darkness here, in this village, with blood and fear. And we have kept it alive, generation after generation, without even realizing it." Eleanor's pulse quickened. The pact was only a part of Darkmoor's story, one chapter in a much longer, more sinister history. The next page contained a rough sketch of the village as it had looked centuries ago, before many of the buildings were constructed. In the center was a familiar mark, the stone altar in the woods. But there was something else, a symbol drawn beside it, one she hadn't seen before. The sketch showed the altar not as an isolated structure, but as the center of a larger design, with symbols and paths leading outward in a pattern that looked almost ritualistic. Beneath the sketch, her spouse had written a single line: "We were never alone." A chilling revelation. As she stared at the words, a chill crept over Eleanor. She flipped through the journal's final pages, reading hurried notes and fragmented observations that painted a picture of Darkmoor's founding more troubling than anything she'd imagined. Her spouse seemed to believe that the founders of Darkmoor had fled from something, a curse or a punishment, and had settled in these woods to escape it. But the darkness had followed them, and in a desperate attempt to control it, they'd created the pact. They had bound not just themselves, but all future generations, to ensure that the curse remained within the village, never able to spread beyond its borders. The pact, then, was not meant to protect Darkmoor from external threats. It was created to trap the darkness within, tethering it to the village with fear, secrecy, and blood. A journey to the old altar. A sense of urgency propelled Eleanor from her cottage. She didn't hesitate as she made her way through the village, past the curious stares of neighbors who'd grown accustomed to her nightly journeys. She returned to the forest, following the path to the altar she'd uncovered weeks before. But this time, she looked upon it with new understanding, seeing not a place of reverence, but a prison. As she reached the clearing, she opened her spouse's journal to the page with the altar sketch and traced her fingers over the intricate symbols. feeling a strange pulse of energy beneath her fingertips. The ground felt alive, humming with an ancient tension she hadn't noticed before. It was as though the land itself held its breath, waiting to see what she would do. In the journal, her spouse had written a note near the sketch. To end the shadows, the chains must be broken at their source. Eleanor set down the journal and examined the altar, searching for signs of the original bindings. Anything that would hint at how the founders had trapped this darkness. Her gaze settled on a series of carvings around the base of the altar, symbols matching those in the journal. She realized that each one represented a family from Darkmoor, bound together in the pact, generation after generation, breaking the chains. Driven by a sense of duty to her spouse, Eleanor pulled a small chisel from her pocket and began to chip away at the symbols, breaking the bonds the founders had created. She worked quickly, but deliberately, each stroke feeling like a release, as though the ground itself was sighing with relief. When she struck the final symbol, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, and the mist lifted, revealing a sky filled with stars. The tension in the air dissipated, and a profound stillness settled over the forest. It was as if the shadows had finally lifted, freed from the prison the founders had constructed centuries before. A new dawn for Darkmoor. Eleanor returned to the village, feeling lighter than she had in months. The dawn broke over Darkmoor, its first rays illuminating the cobblestone streets and casting a warm glow over the village. As she walked through the square, she saw villagers emerging from their homes, rubbing sleep from their eyes and glancing around as if sensing the change. Oswin approached her, his face breaking into a smile as he took in her calm expression. "You've done something, haven't you?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. Eleanor nodded. "The pact is gone, Oswin, truly gone. The chains that bound this village have been broken." The villagers gathered in the square, a mix of awe and relief on their faces. For the first time, they spoke openly of the pact, of their fears, and of the shadows that had haunted them for generations. And though there were whispers of lingering superstition, Eleanor could see that a profound change had taken root. Darkmoor was free, not just from the pact, but from the darkness that had controlled them all. Eleanor's legacy. As the days passed, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. She spent time helping the village heal, sharing her spouse's journal with anyone who wished to read it, encouraging them to embrace their newfound freedom. Though some villagers still clung to their old beliefs, most began to move forward, letting go of the shadows that had once ruled them. Eleanor visited her spouse's resting place often, leaving flowers and quiet words of gratitude. She knew their courage had sparked this change, that it was their legacy that would live on in Darkmoor's freedom. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Eleanor looked out over Darkmoor, feeling the weight of her journey lift completely. She had not only honored her spouse's memory, but she had freed an entire village from a darkness that was never truly theirs to bear. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, one of hope, light, and peace. Chapter 11. A Visitor with Secrets. The first warm days of spring had arrived in Darkmoor, and the village was blooming, transformed in a way that mirrored the hearts of its people. Children played openly in the square. The fields were alive with the season's colors. And even the woods, once dark and foreboding, seemed softer, gentler, as though the shadows had released their hold. Eleanor was in the midst of planting a small garden near her cottage when she saw a rider approaching from the north. Visitors were rare in Darkmoor, and for one to arrive now, so soon after the pact had been broken, stirred a strange feeling in her. She stood and watched as the rider, a middle-aged woman with a serious face and piercing eyes, guided her horse into the village square. The villagers glanced at one another, uncertain, but Eleanor stepped forward, sensing that this visitor had come with purpose. The visitor's tale. The woman dismounted and introduced herself as Lilith Draven, a historian from a neighboring town called Halliford. Her eyes flicked over the village with a curiosity that Eleanor recognized, a look that suggested she already knew more about Darkmoor than she let on. "I heard tales of strange happenings here," Lilith said, her voice low but clear. "Rumors of a pact broken, of a curse lifted. I came to see if there was any truth to it." Eleanor studied her, intrigued but wary. "There's truth in it," she replied cautiously. "Darkmoor was bound by a pact for generations, a pact we no longer serve." Lilith's eyes brightened with interest. "So, it's true," she murmured, more to herself than to Eleanor. "The Pact of Shadows. I've read about it in old records, but I never thought it was anything more than legend." At this, Eleanor's curiosity deepened. "You've read about the pact? What do you know of it?" Lilith glanced around, noticing the villagers gathering nearby, and nodded toward a quieter spot on the edge of the square. Eleanor led her there, and Lilith continued in a low voice. "The Pact of Shadows is not unique to Darkmoor," Lilith explained. "There are records of similar pacts across our region. Small villages, secluded hamlets, each with their own binding rituals meant to ward off a darkness that the founders believed followed them. It's as if your village is part of a larger story, one that has haunted many places for centuries." A troubling connection. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The idea that other villages had lived under similar bonds, bound by the same fear, unsettled her. It meant that Darkmoor's story was not just theirs to bear. It was part of a much older, more widespread phenomenon. "Are these pacts still in place in other villages?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lilith nodded grimly. "In some places, yes, but there's more. The records I found mention a shared origin, a group of settlers who fled from a catastrophe long ago, spreading out across the land and bringing the same darkness with them. Each village was said to have established a pact to contain it, sacrificing freedom for survival. But no one knows exactly what this darkness was, or why it required such loyalty." Eleanor's mind raced. The idea that Darkmoor's pact was part of a network of pacts, each village bound by similar rituals and secrets, was overwhelming. If this was true, then breaking the pact in Darkmoor might have repercussions she hadn't anticipated. Eleanor's decision. That night, Eleanor invited Lilith to her cottage, where they pored over her spouse's journal, comparing the notes and sketches with the records Lilith had brought from Halliford. As they studied the symbols and patterns, Eleanor realized that her spouse's investigation had only scratched the surface. The pact wasn't just a binding ritual for one village. It was part of a complex, intertwined system that spanned regions. One entry in particular caught their attention. It was a rough map, similar to the one Eleanor had found, but this one showed symbols for other villages that had pacts of their own. Lines connected these villages like threads in a web, all centering on a single point, a place called Allaric. Lilith's eyes widened as she looked at the name. Allaric. I've seen that name only once, in a record dated centuries ago. It was described as the origin of the shadows, the place where the first pact was made. Eleanor's pulse quickened. If Allaric was indeed the source of the pact, then it might hold the answers she'd been searching for. Darkmoor's shadows had lifted, but for other villages still bound by their own pacts, Allaric might be the key to breaking free. A new mission. As the dawn broke over Darkmoor, Eleanor felt a new sense of purpose solidify within her. She couldn't ignore the possibility that other villages were suffering as Darkmoor had suffered, bound by fear and secrecy. And if she could find Allaric, if it even still existed, she might uncover the truth that had eluded generations. She shared her decision with Oswin, who listened intently, his expression somber but supportive. "You've already done so much for us, Eleanor," he said, pride in his voice. "But if there are others like us out there, others suffering under the weight of these pacts, then perhaps it's your calling to help them too." Eleanor nodded, touched by his faith in her. She knew the journey would be dangerous, that she would be stepping into a realm of unknowns far beyond anything she'd encountered. But she couldn't deny the call. Darkmoor was finally free, and now it was time to share that freedom with others, preparing for the journey. As she packed her belongings, Eleanor took one last look around her cottage, feeling a pang of sadness at leaving the place she'd fought so hard to save. But she knew that Oswin and the other villagers would protect Darkmoor's new future, ensuring that the pact would never return. Lilith agreed to accompany her, eager to document their journey and learn more about the origins of the pact. Together, they set out, their destination marked only by the faint symbols on an ancient map and the hope that they could uncover the truth behind Allaric. A village united. The villagers gathered to see Eleanor off, their faces a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Oswin stepped forward, handing her a small token, her spouse's charm, now polished and shining. "To remember what you fought for," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And to remind you that Darkmoor stands with you, always." Eleanor accepted the charm, feeling its weight in her hand, a comforting reminder of the home she'd helped to free. She hugged Oswin, her heart full, and turned to the villagers, who cheered as she and Lilith set off down the path toward the unknown. Chapter 12. A Trail of Shadows. The path wound through dense, mist-laden woods, shadows stretching long and ominous in the early dawn light. Eleanor and Lilith rode in silence, the weight of their mission heavy on their minds. With each village they passed, each town they encountered, Eleanor noticed subtle but familiar signs. Half-whispered rumors, glances cast over shoulders, and ancient superstitions that seemed to echo the tales of Darkmoor. They had been traveling for days, following an old map in her spouse's journal that traced a winding route toward Allaric. The journey had already taken them through villages that seemed almost frozen in time, places where the air felt thick with secrets, and the walls whispered of warnings from long ago. Lilith, an avid researcher, often stopped to gather local accounts, taking notes on each village's unique lore and history. Eleanor had grown accustomed to her companion's curious nature, her way of sifting through folklore and reality in search of clues. But as they moved deeper into these isolated lands, Eleanor felt a mounting sense of unease. She began to wonder if their search for Allaric was not only dangerous, but perhaps destined to lead them towards something they were not meant to find: the village of Willowcroft. Their journey brought them to Willowcroft, a small, desolate village nestled in a fog-laden valley. As they approached, Eleanor noticed symbols etched onto the doors and windows of every home, protective sigils, much like those that had once marked the cottages of Darkmoor. She exchanged a glance with Lilith, who looked equally intrigued. "Another village bound by fear," Lilith murmured as they dismounted. "I wonder if their story is similar to Darkmoor's." They approached a villager, an elderly man with a lined face and cautious eyes. He eyed them warily, but agreed to speak with them in exchange for a few coins and the promise of discretion. "We live in peace here, as long as we obey," the man muttered, casting a quick glance toward the looming forest that bordered the village. "The pact was made generations ago. It's the only reason we've survived this long." Eleanor leaned closer. "A pact?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "What kind of pact?" The old man shrugged, as if reluctant to share. "No one speaks of it openly," he said, voice hushed. "But I've heard tell that it binds us to something dark, something that waits beyond the trees. The founders made the pact to keep it away." As they listened, Eleanor felt an eerie familiarity in his words. Each village they passed seemed bound by a similar pact, each one tied to a shadowed history they could not escape. A fading memory. That night, they stayed in a small inn on the edge of Willowcroft, where Lilith pored over her notes, connecting each village to a larger tapestry of legends and superstitions. "It's strange, Eleanor," she mused, looking up from her papers. "Every village we've passed through believes they're alone in this curse, as though each one is isolated by design. They have no knowledge of one another's pacts, yet each community shares the same fear. It's as if someone or something wants them kept apart." Eleanor thought of the map her spouse had sketched, the lines connecting each village to the others, each path leading to Allaric. "It's as if we're being led there," she replied softly, her gaze distant. "As though this darkness has woven itself into the land, tying each village to the others, without them even realizing." Lilith nodded, her expression grim. "If we find Allaric, it may be the only way to break the cycle for everyone." Eleanor shivered, feeling a strange compulsion to reach their destination, even if it meant confronting a force more powerful than she'd ever imagined. The strange markings in the woods. The next morning, they left Willowcroft and continued their journey toward Allaric. But as they rode, they noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, symbols that matched the ones Eleanor had found in Darkmoor and seen on the doors of Willowcroft. The symbols seemed to lead them, each one marking a path deeper into the forest. The air grew colder as they rode, an unnatural chill settling over them, and Eleanor sensed they were being watched, The forest around them felt different from the ones she'd known, older, as though the trees themselves were alive with memory. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and she felt an odd, prickling sensation, as though unseen eyes followed their every step. As they rounded a bend in the path, Lilith suddenly gasped, pulling her horse to a halt. Ahead of them stood a towering stone archway, half covered in moss and tangled vines, its surface carved with the same symbols that marked the trees. Beyond it, the path continued into darkness. "Allaric," Lilith whispered, her voice barely audible. "We found it." The lost village of Allaric. Eleanor's heart raced as they passed beneath the archway and entered the abandoned village. Allaric lay silent and still, its buildings crumbling and overgrown, as though it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the silence was absolute, as if no living creature dared enter this place. They dismounted, leading their horses carefully through the desolate streets, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Every house was marked with protective symbols, and at the center of the village stood a stone altar, larger and more elaborate than any Eleanor had seen before. "This is where it began," Lilith murmured, awe-stricken as she studied the altar. The first pact, the place that bound all the others. Eleanor approached the altar, her hands brushing over the symbols carved into its surface. She could feel an energy radiating from it, a dark, pulsing force that seemed to call out to her, as though the village itself held some remnant of the darkness it had tried to contain. The journal of the founder. As they explored, they found an ancient building that looked like it had once served as a temple or council hall. Inside, they discovered a dusty, forgotten chest. Eleanor knelt and carefully pried it open, revealing a set of old books and scrolls, each one meticulously preserved despite the decay around them. Lilith took one of the books, a heavy leather-bound volume, and began to read aloud. "We came to these woods in desperation, fleeing the ruin we had brought upon ourselves. The darkness followed, unyielding, relentless. We could not escape it, so we did the only thing we could. We bound it to us, contained it within a pact that would last for as long as we remained loyal. We swore to keep the shadows at bay, to pass the burden down through the generations. And so the pact was made, an unbreakable chain to preserve our survival, knowing that if we faltered, the darkness would rise again." Eleanor felt a chill as the words sank in. The founders had not simply fled a curse. They had brought it with them, tethered it to themselves, and to every village that followed. Allaric was not just the origin of the pact. It was the prison that held the darkness bound. "They didn't just bind it to Darkmoor," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "They bound it to themselves, to each generation that followed. It's a curse that has spread from village to village, passed down like an infection. And it will only be broken if..." Lilith finished her thought. "If the original pact is destroyed, a reckoning at the altar." Together, they returned to the altar at the center of Allaric. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of countless lives, of generations who had suffered under the pact's curse. She pulled out a small chisel and began chipping away at the symbols on the altar, just as she had done in Darkmoor. Each strike of her chisel seemed to resonate through the air, as if the very foundations of the pact were beginning to crack. As she chipped away the final symbol, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the village. The air felt charged, alive with energy, and Eleanor braced herself, feeling as though the ground might give way beneath her feet. With one last swing, the symbol broke, and a sudden rush of wind swept through the village, scattering leaves and dust as the oppressive energy dissipated, leaving only silence in its wake. A new dawn for the pacted villages. Eleanor and Lilith stood together, feeling the weight lift from Allaric. The pact was finally broken, the darkness released, its bonds shattered. They knew that across the region, villages bound by the same pacts would feel the change, that those still haunted by shadows would finally be free. As they left Allaric, Eleanor felt a profound sense of closure, a peace she had not known since her spouse's death. Darkmoor was free, and now so was she. She had fulfilled the promise she had made to her spouse, and she knew they would be at peace, knowing that the shadows were gone, that no other village would live in fear of a pact that should never have existed. Chapter 13. Return to Darkmoor. The journey back to Darkmoor was different from the one Eleanor and Lilith had taken to Allaric. This time, the shadows felt lighter. The weight of fear finally lifted. As they approached the village, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar peace settle within her, a calm she hadn't known since her spouse's death. She had faced the darkness, shattered its hold, and liberated countless villages from a centuries-old curse. When they arrived in Darkmoor, villagers gathered in the square, greeting Eleanor with awe and gratitude. Word had spread quickly of her journey to Allaric, and she was welcomed back as a savior, a figure of courage who had dared to challenge a force that had ruled over them for generations. As Oswin approached her, his face split in a wide smile. Eleanor felt a deep warmth in her heart. "You've done it, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We're free, truly free. You have given Darkmoor a future." Eleanor smiled back, feeling a sense of closure and relief. The pact was gone, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life might be like beyond the shadows. Celebration and healing. That night, the village gathered in the tavern to celebrate. Laughter and music filled the air, and the rooms were packed with people eager to share their gratitude with Eleanor. She spoke with villagers who had once been bound by fear, and as she listened to their stories, she felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the work her spouse had begun was now complete. Lilith, always one for stories, regaled the crowd with tales of their journey to Allaric, her voice animated as she described the abandoned village and the altar that had held the darkness captive. The villagers hung on her every word, marveling at the bravery it had taken to confront such ancient mysteries. As the night wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of the past finally lift from her shoulders. She had kept her promise to her spouse, fulfilled her duty to Darkmoor, and ensured that no one else would suffer under the shadow of the pact. The village was safe, and her work was done. Or so she thought. A strange artifact. As the crowd began to disperse, one of the elders, a woman named Thalia, approached Eleanor, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her expression was solemn, her eyes thoughtful as she held the bundle out to Eleanor. "I wanted to give you this," Thalia said. her voice soft but steady. "I found it years ago, buried near the edge of the woods, near the same altar where we made our offerings. I never understood what it was, but I think it's meant for you." Eleanor unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small stone amulet. It was engraved with a symbol she hadn't seen before, a spiral that seemed to twist inward, drawing her gaze. The stone had an unusual sheen, almost iridescent, and as she held it, she felt a strange warmth radiate from it. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, frowning as she turned the amulet over in her hands. Thalia shook her head. "I don't know, but it always seemed ancient, older than the pact, even older than the stories we know. I think it has something to do with the land itself, something that goes beyond the pact. My grandmother once said it was a relic of the first people, but she never explained." Eleanor's curiosity stirred. She thought back to Darkmoor, to the strange feeling she'd had in the woods, as though the land itself held secrets she hadn't yet uncovered. A new mystery unfolds. The next day, Eleanor met with Lilith to discuss the amulet. Lilith examined it closely, her eyes alight with excitement. "This symbol," she murmured, tracing the spiral with her finger. "I've seen it mentioned in only the oldest records, in accounts that speak of something called the Source." "The Source," Eleanor repeated, feeling a familiar thrill of discovery. "What does that mean?" Lilith's expression turned thoughtful. "The Source is described as the origin of the shadows, a place where the world was said to split between light and dark. It was believed to be a physical location, a place of power. Some stories say that those who reached it could commune with the land itself, unlocking secrets that were thought lost to time." Eleanor felt a shiver run through her. Could that be the real source of the pacts? Not just Darkmoor, but something even older? Lilith nodded slowly. Perhaps. The pacts could be remnants of something far more ancient, rituals meant to contain powers that once flowed freely through the land. If that's true, then the pact's darkness may only be a fragment of a much larger story, one that we've only begun to understand. Visions of the past. That night, as Eleanor held the amulet and reflected on Lilith's words, she felt an odd sensation, an almost magnetic pull toward the woods. She slipped outside, clutching the amulet tightly, and made her way to the edge of the village, where the trees stood tall and silent in the moonlight. As she stepped into the forest, she felt the world around her shift, as though she were entering a place beyond time. Shadows danced among the trees, but this time they felt different. Not ominous, but ancient, wise, as though they held memories of things long forgotten. Eleanor closed her eyes, clutching the amulet tightly, and an image flashed in her mind. A vast, open field bathed in twilight, where figures cloaked in white stood in a circle. Hands joined as they chanted. At the center of the circle was a single stone, carved with the same spiral symbol on her amulet. She felt a voice, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, whisper in her mind. The Source awaits those who seek. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the forest, the vision fading, but the weight of its message remained. The path to the Source. Eleanor returned to the village at dawn, where she shared her experience with Lilith, who listened with rapt attention. Together, they studied the amulet and discussed what the vision might mean. The source may be more than a place, Lilith speculated. It could be a way of understanding, a connection to the land, a way to unlock its mysteries. Eleanor nodded, a sense of resolve filling her. Whatever it is, I believe it's calling to us. If this source is the origin of the shadows, then it's something we need to understand. Darkmoor may be free from the pact, but if there's a greater force at work, we need to uncover it before it surfaces again. Oswin, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward, his face solemn. "If you go, Eleanor, you'll have our support," he said. "You've done so much for Darkmoor, but we would never ask you to take on more than you already have." Eleanor smiled softly. "Thank you, Oswin. But this is something I have to do, not just for Darkmoor, but for all those who might still be affected by whatever lies beyond the pact. I can't ignore the call." A final farewell. With the villagers' blessings and Lilith by her side, Eleanor prepared for yet another journey. As she left Darkmoor, she looked back at the village one last time, feeling both sadness and hope. This new mystery felt different from the pact. It was as though she were being drawn towards something unknown, yet deeply familiar. The journey to the source would be unlike any she had taken before. A quest to confront not just the darkness that had haunted Darkmoor, but the primal forces that had shaped the world itself. And though she knew the road ahead would be perilous, she felt ready. As the village faded from view, she tightened her grip on the amulet, feeling its warmth seep into her hand. The spiral etched into its surface seemed to glow faintly, as though urging her forward. Chapter 14. The Journey to the Source. Eleanor and Lilith moved through forests untouched by time, where the trees towered like sentinels, and the air felt thick with memory. Each step into the ancient woods felt like a step into another world, one that breathed with secrets and shadows. The amulet Eleanor carried grew warm against her chest, pulsing with a faint energy that seemed to guide them, urging them deeper into the unknown. The journey had been long and arduous, and with each day, the landscapes grew stranger. Forgotten temples and ancient markings lined their path, remnants of a people who had once communed with the land in ways no one in Darkmoor could comprehend. Lilith paused to study a crumbling stone marked with spirals and symbols, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These symbols," she murmured, tracing them with her fingers. "They all point toward one place. It's as though this entire region was designed to lead people to the source." Eleanor felt a shiver run through her. "As if it was calling to them," she said softly, feeling the pull of the amulet grow stronger with each step they took. A lost temple. As they ventured further, they came upon the ruins of a vast temple, hidden beneath a canopy of trees and nearly swallowed by thick vines. The structure was ancient, its stone walls etched with carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light filtering through the trees. Lilith knelt by one of the walls, her eyes widening as she examined a series of carvings that depicted a group of robed figures standing in a circle, their hands raised in invocation around a large stone, marked with the same spiral symbol that adorned Eleanor's amulet. "This must have been a place of worship," Lilith whispered, awe in her voice. "The people who lived here believed the source was a living presence, something they could commune with. Eleanor felt an intense energy radiating from the stones, as though the temple itself still pulsed with the echoes of ancient rituals. She reached out, her hand brushing against the stone, and in that moment, a vision flooded her mind. A vision of the source. She saw a gathering of people, dressed in robes, their faces solemn as they chanted in unison around the spiral-marked stone. The air hummed with power, and in the center of their circle, a dark energy rose, swirling and twisting like a living shadow. The figures raised their hands, guiding the energy, shaping it, binding it to the land. The vision shifted, and Eleanor saw glimpses of villages scattered across the region. Villages that bore the same symbols, that held the same secrets in their silence. Each one was bound to the source, each one tied by an unbreakable thread of loyalty and fear. The vision faded, leaving Eleanor breathless. She looked at Lilith, who was watching her with concern. "What did you see?" Lilith asked. "The source," Eleanor whispered. "It's not just a place, it's a force, something they summoned and bound. The founders of these villages, they weren't just protecting themselves from the shadows. They were containing something powerful. The warnings of the past." They continued deeper into the temple, where they found a set of stone tablets arranged in a small alcove. The tablets were etched with ancient writings, and Lilith carefully translated as best as she could, her voice soft and reverent. To seek the source is to seek the balance between light and shadow. We are bound to it, for it is the thread that weaves the world. But beware, the source is neither good nor evil. It is power, pure and untempered, and those who reach it, unprepared, risk being consumed by it. Eleanor felt the weight of the warning settle over her. "It sounds as if the source is a gateway," she murmured. "A way to commune with something beyond our understanding." Lilith nodded slowly. "Or perhaps it's a test, a force that allows those who are worthy to wield its power, but only if they understand the balance it represents." The words filled Eleanor with a mix of awe and apprehension. She realized that if they continued, they would be risking more than just their lives. The source might demand something from them, something they could not take back. The final leg of the journey. Despite the risks, Eleanor and Lilith pressed forward, following the amulet's gentle pulse. They journeyed through winding trails and overgrown paths, passing relics of forgotten civilizations that had once sought the source. Their stories lost to time. The landscape grew increasingly surreal, with twisted trees and stones that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Finally, after days of travel, they reached the edge of a vast clearing. At its center was a stone platform, carved with intricate spirals and markings that radiated outward like spokes of a wheel. At the heart of the platform was a single, massive stone, the source, pulsing faintly with an otherworldly glow. Eleanor and Lilith approached, their footsteps slow and reverent. As they neared the stone, Eleanor felt a powerful energy course through her, a sensation that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She sensed that the source was alive, a conscious presence that seemed to be waiting, watching. The challenge of the source. As she reached out to touch the stone, a voice echoed in her mind, deep and resonant. "Do Do you seek balance, or do you seek power? Eleanor hesitated, feeling the weight of the question press down on her. She knew that the pact had been a way of containing the power of the source, a way of binding it to human will. But now she understood that it was not meant to be controlled. It was a force of nature, a primal energy that demanded respect. I seek balance, Eleanor replied, her voice steady. The villages have suffered under fear and shadows because we tried to control what was never ours to bind. I seek only to bring peace, to let the source remain free, so that it can guide us without our interference. The energy around her seemed to shift, and she sensed the source probing her intentions, testing the truth of her words. She glanced at Lilith, who nodded in silent support, her own expression solemn. A final revelation. The source responded with a flood of images, showing Eleanor a vision of what could be. A world where the villages lived without fear, where the land itself held wisdom that could be shared, not contained. She saw Darkmoor and the other villages thriving, connected not by fear, but by understanding, each place a part of a greater whole. And then the vision faded, and she felt a warmth settle over her, a reassurance that the balance she sought was possible. But with that reassurance came a warning. The source was a force of duality, of both light and shadow, and it would never be fully tamed. She understood that while the villages were free from the pact, they would always carry the potential for both creation and destruction. The source was not a power to wield, but a presence to respect, one that demanded humility. Returning to Darkmoor. As Eleanor and Lilith turned away from the source, they felt a deep peace settle over them, a sense of closure. They had sought answers, and they had found not only the truth of the source, but the wisdom to leave it undisturbed. When they returned to Darkmoor, the villagers welcomed them with open arms. Eleanor shared her story, explaining that the pact's darkness was no longer a threat, that the land itself was free, and that the source would remain as a reminder of the balance that must be respected. The village celebrated their return, embracing the freedom they had longed for. But Eleanor knew that they would not forget the lessons learned, that the memory of the source would remain as a reminder of the power that lay within the land, a force that could only be honored, never controlled. Embracing a new future. In the days that followed, Eleanor felt herself at peace for the first time in years. The darkness that had haunted her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength that came from understanding. She had uncovered the truth of the pact, of the source, and of the balance that lay between light and shadow. With Darkmoor now free, she felt ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. And as she looked out over the village, she knew that her journey had given her a gift beyond words, a connection to the land, to her people, and to the mysteries that lay within the world itself. She would carry that gift with her always, a quiet reminder of the courage it had taken to confront the shadows, and the wisdom it had taken to leave them in peace. Epilogue. A new calling. The morning light filtered softly through Eleanor's cottage, illuminating the symbols and notes she had gathered over her journey. She sat quietly by the window, gazing out over Darkmoor as villagers went about their morning tasks. The shadows of the past, now only faint memories. The village was at peace, and so finally, was Eleanor. She thought of her spouse, of the sacrifices that had brought Darkmoor to this point, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had done what she set out to do, honoring their memory and freeing her home from fear. Her life now was simpler. She tended to her small garden, shared stories with Oswin and Lilith, and felt the steady rhythm of village life around her. Yet, even as she settled into this newfound calm, Eleanor sensed a part of her that remained attuned to the mysteries of the land. Her journey had transformed her, connecting her to a vast and ancient network of wisdom and secrets. And though she felt no compulsion to seek out further mysteries, she knew that her path had only begun. The arrival of a letter. One afternoon, a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find a messenger, a young woman with an air of urgency, holding a sealed letter. "This came for you, Lady Eleanor," the messenger said, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and respect. It traveled far, from the scholars at the university in the capital. Eleanor's curiosity piqued. She thanked the messenger and closed the door, breaking the seal on the letter and reading its contents. The letter was from a scholar named Eamon Ardent, who introduced himself as a historian specializing in ancient civilizations. He had heard of her journey to Allaric and her efforts to break Darkmoor's pact, and was captivated by the legends she had uncovered. His letter was filled with admiration for her courage, and with details of a mystery that he believed only someone like her could solve. "Lady Eleanor," the letter read, "I seek your expertise, your courage, and your wisdom. The source you uncovered is but one piece of a far larger tapestry. I have found fragments of records that speak of a hidden order, an ancient society dedicated to preserving the balance between light and shadow. Their influence extends far beyond our land, and I believe they were guardians of a power even older than the pacts. If you are willing, I invite you to the capital to help us decipher these records, to unravel a mystery that could change our understanding of our world and its history. The journey may be dangerous, but I believe you are the only one who can unlock its secrets." Eleanor set the letter down, her heart racing. The life of quiet peace she had imagined for herself was suddenly filled with new possibilities. The idea of a hidden order, of guardians who had once protected the balance she had fought to preserve, stirred something within her. A yearning for knowledge, for purpose beyond her village. A conversation with Oswin and Lilith. That evening, Eleanor shared the letter with Oswin and Lilith, who listened with rapt attention. Lilith's eyes sparkled with excitement as she read Eamon's words, her mind already racing with the possibilities of what they might uncover. "This is extraordinary," Lilith exclaimed. "If what he says is true, then the source may be just one part of a greater truth. Imagine a society dedicated to the preservation of balance, stretching back centuries, perhaps even millennia." Oswin, though visibly impressed, looked at Eleanor with a mixture of concern and respect. "You've done so much already, Eleanor. Darkmoor owes you more than we can ever repay. Are you sure you want to take this on?" Eleanor felt a calm certainty settle over her. "I've done my duty to Darkmoor," she replied. "But this feels like something I was meant to do. I felt the presence of the source, seen glimpses of something larger. I need to understand it." Lilith grinned. clearly hoping to join her friend on this new adventure. Then we go together, just as we did before. Eleanor smiled, deeply grateful for Lilith's unwavering friendship. Then it settled. We'll go to the capital, meet the scholar, and see what mysteries await. A new journey begins. The next morning, Eleanor prepared for the journey, packing only what she needed, including the amulet from Darkmoor and her spouse's journal, both constant reminders of the journey that had shaped her. She said her farewells to the villagers, who wished her well with heartfelt words of gratitude and pride. Oswin clasped her hand warmly, promising that Darkmoor would be waiting for her when she returned. As she and Lilith set off, Eleanor felt a familiar thrill, a sense of stepping into the unknown, of embracing a destiny that had waited for her all along. The road to the capital was long, but with each step, she felt her purpose deepen, her bond with the land and its mysteries grow stronger. In the distance, the capital city rose like a beacon, its walls gleaming in the morning sun, and Eleanor knew that a new chapter in her life was about to unfold. A final reflection. As they traveled, Eleanor thought of her spouse, of the vision they had shared to free Darkmoor and break the chains of fear. She knew that her journey had been not just a battle against shadows, but a journey toward understanding the delicate balance that held the world together. She was no longer just a villager from Darkmoor. She was a seeker, a guardian of the balance between light and dark. Her journey had transformed her, and as she approached the capital, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The mysteries she had uncovered were only the beginning. And with Lilith by her side and a heart open to discovery, Eleanor knew that her life, her purpose, and her understanding of the world would only continue to deepen. The land awaited her, its secrets as ancient as time itself, and she was ready to listen.